Hey everyone, I'm Joshua Deemer and welcome back to Lesson 8 of our Java Programming tutorial series. Let's jump right into the lesson. Today, we'll be looking at loops in Java. We'll start with while, continue with do while, and then end on for loops. Loops are very helpful for getting redundant code out of the way. Let's take a look at the syntax of a while loop. It is while, then in parentheses you have your boolean. Then you have curly braces, and your looping code will be inside those curly braces. Let's take a look as to how this works in code. Let's go ahead and create our while loop. So if I type while, then in parentheses I type in true. This is a boolean after all. And then our curly braces. What this will do is, while this statement in these parentheses are true, continuously run this. So if I type system.out.println hello and run it, you'll see that this never stops, and over here you can kind of watch it twitch a little bit. But it'll constantly say hello until I forcibly terminate this program. And if I scroll, there are many hellos. Many hellos. And that's because it is running this as many times as a computer can every single second. Okay, so while true means that this while statement will never end. It's just going to keep on going forever and ever. Let's say we have a boolean out here though. Call this a equals true. And then while a. Or we can do while a equals true, or not a, or does not equal true, whatever we want in order to match our programming style. Well, what this will do is pretty much the same exact thing, because we are still saying it's true. What if it's false? If we run this now, nothing will run because the condition for continuing this code is no longer true. This is especially helpful for game loops. So for example, if we call this if the game is running, or let's just be more precise, is game running equals true, and then I have is game running, then we want to run this as much as we possibly can, unless of course there's a frame rate limit or something along those lines. And once the game is done running, we set this to false somewhere else. We reinitialize it as false elsewhere. So let's say if 5 equals 5, then set is game running to false. So once a certain condition is filled, we can make this false, and it'll stop running. So now that I ran it, you'll see that it printed hello, it set the game to false, then it tried to check if it's running, which it's not anymore. So therefore it only printed one time. Now let's say we have something like this, where we have an item set to 0, and we have an infinite loop here. Okay, then inside of the loop, we print out the item and increment it by 1. What's going to happen here is you're going to print out 0 because that's what it's first set to. Then it's reinitialized to going from 0 to 1. Then in here, we print out 1 now because this was incremented. So it loops back to here. Then this increments to 2, and so now it'll print 2. Then it increments to 3, and it continues onward as fast as the computer can. So if we run this, you can see it goes very fast because computers are very quickly, but it is incrementing by 1. If I pause this or I terminate it, you'll see that it truly is only going up by 1. So all these massive numbers are valid by going up by 1. So we can also end this by running a certain amount of items, saying item is less than 10, for example. Now, what this does is it sets it to 0. Is item less than 10? Yes, it is. So we'll run this. So this says 0. This goes up by 1. Now it goes all the way back to this condition again. Is 1 less than 10? Yes. Okay, let's run it again. So it'll keep going. So now it's 9. Okay, it'll keep going up to 9. And so this is printing out 9. It goes to 10. Is 10 less than 10? No, it's not. So it'll exit the while loop. So outside of here, I'm going to say system out.println exited. So we run this. You see it runs from 0 to 9. And so since 10 is not true, then it will exit and it'll say exited. This is more appropriate to use a for loop for, but we'll go over that shortly. A do-while loop is very similar to a while loop, but let's take a look at its syntax really quick. We've got do, then curly braces. Inside those curly braces, we want the code that we want to loop. Outside of the curly braces, we say while. In parentheses, we have our boolean, and then finally a semicolon. Let's take a look at this in code. Let's go ahead and create our do while loops. We type do, curly braces, then while, we'll say true for now. Let's say system.out.println do while running. And if we run this, we can see that it is infinitely printing this. Okay, that's good. But what if we set this to false? This is one of the biggest differences between a while and a do while. So if we run this here, you'll see it says do while running, even though this is never true. So a while loop will never print the item inside of it if it is false. A do while loop will print it at least one time. It'll guarantee at least one run through. Let's go ahead and take a look at this as well. Int item equals 0. Then we'll print out our item just like before in our other example with the while loop. So if, come on, item is less than 10, and run this, it runs just like a normal while loop. However, the way that it works is different. Okay, we have this int item equals 0, then it runs the printing, then it increments, and then it checks the condition. If this condition is false, it'll just continue on down here, but if it's true, it goes back up. So a do while loop is always guaranteed to run at least once. A for loop is a little more confusing than a while or do while loop. Let's go over the syntax for it. It is for, then inside of parentheses, you have the starting statement, semicolon, the boolean, semicolon, and then the incrementing statement. Outside of those parentheses, you have curly braces once again. Inside those curly braces, you can use that as the loop. Now let's go over this for loop together. It is a little confusing at first. So we type in for, our parentheses, then our starting statement. This can really be almost anything, but you can say, for example, int item equals 0. Then we add our semicolon. Then we add our boolean. So what I'm going to say is our item is less than 10. Another semicolon. Then we have our incrementing statement. And so I'll type item plus plus. And we have our curly braces. So the way that this for loop runs is it runs this first. Okay? So this is first, and this runs only once. It creates this item variable. Then we check this boolean. Is this boolean true? If it's true, then we run this code. Then afterwards, we run this incrementing statement. Okay, so let's go over this as we have it right now. Let's actually also add system.out.println item. You can go ahead and give a guess what this will be printing out, but if we have this, it creates item variable and sets it to 0. This is true because 0 is less than 10. Then it runs this code and prints out 0. Then it comes to this increment and increments. So now item is 1. Then it runs this boolean again. Then it runs this again, and then it increments. So this is only ran once, but these two are run every single time that the loop completes itself. Okay, so a for loop is actually very useful for, let's say, having an integer array items is equal to a new integer array of 10 items. So we could say the first item equals 10, the second item equals 20, the third item equals 30, and go on like that. Or we can just set them all to 0 if we want. Okay? But loops make this much easier. Let's go ahead and clear this up. So we say the item is set to 0 first because we want to be able to set the first item inside of our array. Okay, so now what we can do is we can say the items array of the item is equal to 0. What this does is it gets our current item, which is 0, and sets it to 0 here. Then we go to the next item. In fact, let's change this to A so it's a little less confusing. So we set the 0th item, so the first item, to 0. Then we go through and it sets the second item to 0 because now A is 1, and so it sets items of 1 to 0. That sets items of 2 to 0, all the way up until 10, which is the size of our array. If I were to set this to 20, and I were to say system.out.println items of 4, we'll just grab a random one and run it, you'll see that it is 20. Even though we haven't manually set it, our loop has set every item inside of our array to 20. Now, what if I change this to 1,000? Well, only the first 10 items inside of our items array will actually become populated. That's because I only go to 10. If I were to change this to 1,000, then this loop will run 1,000 times because it'll go 0 incremented by 1 to 1,000, right? It'll only set it, or it'll set them all to 0 then. But if I said this was 1, it'll run 1 time because it'll go from 0 to 1 incrementing by 1, and then it'll set that item to 0. But if I set this to 10,000, then it'll set all 1,000 and go beyond, which is where we can get our index out of bounds exception. That's because we went over, if we have only 1,000 items, but we try to set the 1,001th item, it's going to crash our program because it's outside of our array. So remember that. Now, if you want to match this array always, all you need to do is say items.length. If you remember from our arrays episode, this will get the size of our array, and so that way you can never make that mistake, unless if you say lesser than or equal to, or length plus 5, because then you'll go outside of the array's boundaries. However, if we do this and set this to 20, and let's say we print out items of 500, this will now equal 20. And we can spice this up a little bit if we want, and we can say A times 20. If we run this now, it'll say 10,000. That is because A is equal to 500, right? Because we're getting the 500th item. So A is equal to 500. We multiply that by 20. That's equal to 10,000. I realize that for loops are a lot more confusing, but hopefully this helps. One more thing before we continue to our final topic is you can also use this. So let's do int a equals 0. A is less than the length of the items. A plus plus. You can also make it so you use this to get the items in your array. Let's print this. You'll now see that it's printed every single item inside of our items array. And you can see that they do, in fact, increment by 20 like we asked it to here. So let's go ahead and take a look at another example with a for loop and introduce enhanced for loops while we're at it. So I made a string array of names, and there are 5 items in this string array. Then I populated it essentially with some common Jame names. Maybe not so common, I don't know. But I just did whatever popped into my mind first. So one thing that I did before was I said for int a equals 0. Really, what we normally do is we have for int I equals 0. It does not matter what you use, but for an incrementing variable inside of a for loop, generally it's most commonly accepted to use the variable name I. So we set it equal to 0, and we say I is less than names.length. So we get how many items there are. I can just say 5, but names.length is a little more professional and understandable and easier to read over time. So then we have I plus plus. We increment one at a time. Now you can do I plus equals 2 if you want, or I divide by equals 2, whatever you want. It's up to you what you want to do with that increment. But if we're going through every single item in this array, we're doing plus plus. So now I want to print them out. So we'll do print line, names of the variable I. So again, what this will do is it'll set it to 0. Then it'll get the first items, because 0 is the first item inside of an array. It'll get the first item and print it out. Then it'll increment by 1. It's not greater than or equal to the length of names. And so we get the second item because now I is 1. And it'll continue until we have completed our loop. So if we run this, it says Josh, Jeff, Jeffrey, Joseph, and Jimmy. Now there's a lot of unique things you can do with this. Like for example, I said plus equals 2. If we do this, it'll get every other item because now it's going from I0 to I2 to I4. And so it'll go 0 to 4, which is Josh, Jeremy, and Jimmy. And that's exactly what you see here. We can also go minus minus, but this will throw an error because -1 is outside of the boundary for an array, which is 0 to 4. Right? 0 to 4 because we have 5 items. And so what you can also do is, let's say you want it to go backwards. Okay, well, let's go ahead and start the I variable at the length. Come on, names.length. Then we check if it's greater than 0. And then we decrement instead of increment. If we run this, you'll see another error, because index 5 is outside of bounds for length 5. That's because the name's length is 5, so we're setting this to 5. However, when we try to print names of 5, it won't work because 5 is actually 6 inside of the amount of items, because remember, we start counting from 0. so we need to subtract 1 from the name's length. If we print this now, you'll see that it prints everything except for Josh, my name. That's because we decrement, so if I is 1 now, and we decrement to 0, 0 is no longer greater than 0, and so it never prints out the first item of the list. So what you can do is you can say greater than or equal to 0, or greater than -1, whichever you prefer. I like greater than or equal to 0. And so now it prints it out backwards, because we start from the end of the array and go to the beginning of the array, decrementing. Okay, so that's some fancy stuff for a for loop. What about an enhanced for loop? Well, let's revert this back to what it originally was with incrementing, because that's half of how a enhanced for loop works. The way it works is you have for, then you insert the data type of the array, which is a string. So, string, I'm going to name it an item, and then you add a colon and say names. You say the list that you want to go through. This is called an enhanced for loop. So we're taking all the items inside of names and we're running through them. We don't get this fancy I variable, so we can't say something like item space I plus names. We can't say something like this, sadly. So if I ran this and save it, you'll see it says item 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or we can say I plus 1 surrounded by parentheses, so it actually does addition rather than concatenating. When we run it, it says item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, we can do fancy things with our index. We can't do that here because we don't have our int I anymore. Now, of course, you can do that on the outside, but there's not really much of a point of that. You might as well just use the normal for loop. But all you gotta do now is system.out.println item. And so this is technically grabbing the current item in the iteration of the names variable. And so let's go ahead and comment this out so that it doesn't run that one anymore. And you'll see that it does run it properly. The final part of this lesson will be discussing the continue and break keywords. Let's go into them. So here I've created a basic for loop that'll count from 0 to 10. Let me go ahead and add a system.out.println the current iteration of our loop. Okay, so if these weren't here, this would print 0 to 10. So let's go ahead and break down what continue and break do. So continue makes it so that it skips our current iteration of the loop, while break exits the loop entirely. It'll exit the nearest loop entirely. You can have nested loops, but it'll break the nearest one. So let's say we did have another for loop here. Okay, let's just say it's like this and it's really ugly. All right, that won't work either. Let's do I is less than 10. Like this. There we go. Now it won't crash on us. But let's say it's like this, right? This break will only break this for loop, and it does not break this one because that's not the for loop it is inside. Okay? So what will run if we run this? Well, it'll say 0 first because none of these conditions are true for 0. None of these conditions are true for 1, so it'll just run all the way down to print line and print 1. But once we get to 2, it'll say I equals 2, which is true, and it'll continue, which means it skips the rest of this entire loop and starts all the way over. Okay? But of course, it'll still run the incrementing statement and the Boolean to make sure that everything's still good. So now it's 3, but it doesn't print out. So this is skip, skip, skip. 3 is printed. 4, skip, 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 printed. Now number 5, it hits 5, and now we break. Okay, so this will exit the for loop, meaning this for loop is done, and whatever is outside underneath it will run. So let's go ahead and say it is exited, and run it. We'll say 0, 1, 3, 4, because remember 2 is a skipped iteration, and then it is exited. If, let's say I had this up here, okay, and I ran it, it would say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's because the continue is underneath the printing. It'll print first, then it will continue. Keep that in mind. Now, let's remove these two and run it. Oh, sorry, let's move this to underneath. So we removed the break, and so we only have the continues now. So we run this, and you'll see that 2 is missing, and so is 8, because those iterations are skipped. If I move this in the middle and run it, you will see 2 is skipped, but not 8. That's because 8 is underneath the print line. The order of your code does matter, so keep that in mind. So now that we understand loops a little bit, let's go over them in practice. So what I want you guys to do is create one of each loop: a while, do while, for, and enhanced for. So 4 total loops. I want you to try and only use one overarching variable and one incrementer for each loop. So 5 maximum variables. So 1 variable, which is used in every loop, and then 4 incrementers. Then I want you to make sure you can use continue at least twice, and to use break at least 1 time. Break and continue can be used in while, do while, for, and in enhanced for loops. They can be used in all of them. Okay? So bonus, if you want to challenge yourself a bit, go ahead and make one of those loops use the random data type and create an array of random numbers. Kind of like a random number generator sort of thing. Alright, go ahead and pause the video if you want to do this on your own. Otherwise, we're getting started now. So I'm going to create an int array. An int array of ages equals a new int array of 10 items. Then we're going to say while. Then we'll say while true. We're going to make this an infinite loop. Then we will say if true, then we'll break. Then up here we'll say system.out.println infinite loop. Oh no. Then down here we're going to say do while. We'll do true again. And we'll say system.out.println another one. And in here we'll say int I equals 0. I plus plus. If I equals 1, then break. Okay. Then we'll go ahead and say, I'll zoom out a little bit. So then let's go ahead and say for int I equals 0. I is less than the length of ages, and I plus plus. Let's go ahead and do this bonus. So in here I'm going to say random. That's the data type. We'll call it random equals a new random. You'll notice there's an error, so we need to hover over it and import it. Okay, because it's part of the java.util package. So now, what we can do is we can say ages of 0 is equal, or not of 0, of I is equal to random dot next integer. So this will get us a random integer. If we hover over it, it'll tell us a little about it. It'll say all 2 to the power of 32 possible int values are produced with approximately equal probability. Okay, well, I just want it to be from 1 to 21. So what this does is it goes between 0 and the inclusive of the number you put inside of here. Okay, the bound. And so it's going to go from 0 to 20, then we add 1 to that random number. Okay, so now we're going to do our enhanced for loop for int age in ages. And then let's print it out. Right, line age. If we run this, we'll see infinite loop. Oh no, another one. Then we got 6, 5, 2, 1, 21, 19, 15, 6, 18, 3. There's 2 things we missed. Well, one thing we missed, which is using a continue. So I'm going to say if I is equal to, random.nextInt of, how many items do we have? Ages.length. Then we'll continue. That looks a little confusing. I'll break it down in a second. Otherwise, if I is equal to 0, then continue. All right, so we have 2 conditions as to where we'll want to continue. I could technically combine these and say and this is, or this is 0, but for the example's sake, I'm going to make this just separate. So here we're checking if I is equal to the random number from 0 to the length of our ages array. And so what this does is if our current iteration, which is from 0 to our ages array lengths, or ages array's length, it is a 1 in 10 possibility of it getting skipped every single time. Then we have it always skips the first one. So if we run this, it'll print 0, 18, 2, 2, 4, 11, 3, 13, 15, and 1. You'll notice that this one is 0, and 0 is supposed to be impossible. Well, that's because it skips the very first item. Because it skips the first item, its default is 0. If we run this a couple more times, we'll see that one of our random numbers hit and it's 0. So this one made a second one skip right here. Okay, so we successfully added our little bonus. That's the end of this episode. Next episode, we will work on our first project in Java using what we've learned so far. The project is simple. Record input from a user and print it out in a sentence. Thanks for watching. Feel free to comment what your thoughts are on the series so far down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss a video. Bye!